The Feast of Fools was a strange tradition. It happened in the Middle Ages, mostly in France, but in other parts of Europe too. It took place during the Christmas season. Specifically, it was concentrated in the days between Christmas and Epiphany. This was a time for celebration, but the Feast of Fools was a different kind of celebration. It was a day of chaos, a day when everything was flipped on its head. The main idea was role reversal. The people with the least power got to be in charge for a day, and the people with the most power had to watch. This wasn't a peasant revolt, it wasn't a political movement, it started inside the church itself. The main participants were the lower clergy. These were the subdeacons, the deacons, the choir boys. The men at the very bottom of the church hierarchy. For one day, they were in control. They would elect a leader from among their own ranks. This leader had many names. Sometimes he was the Lord of Misrule. In England, a similar tradition had the boy bishop. In France, he might be called the Pope of Fools or the Abbot of Unreason. This mock leader was given the symbols of real power. He would wear the bishop's robes, often inside out. He would carry the bishop's staff, the crozier, but he would hold it upside down. He was a parody of authority. Once elected, the Lord of Misrule and his followers would take over the cathedral. This was the heart of the feast. The most sacred space in the city became a stage for absurdity. They didn't just party in the church, they mocked the most sacred rituals of the Christian faith. The Mass itself was turned into a joke. Imagine a cathedral, a place of quiet prayer and solemnity. On this day, it was filled with shouting and laughter. The clergy would wear masks or dress in women's clothes. They would sing rude songs instead of holy hymns. They would eat black puddings and sausages right on the altar where the Eucharist was normally celebrated. They would play dice on the altar steps. The air, usually filled with the sweet smell of incense, was filled with the smoke of burning shoe leather. They would put old stinking souls in the censer and swing it around, creating a foul smoke that filled the holy space. The normal order was gone. The subdeacons, who usually served quietly, were now giving nonsensical sermons from the pulpit. And they would make animal noises, they would tell obscene jokes, the congregation, instead of responding with amen, might be told to bray like a donkey. Sometimes, a real donkey was brought into the church. This was part of a related festival, the Feast of the Ass, which often blended with the Feast of Fools. The donkey was a symbol of the animal that carried Mary to Bethlehem, but on this day it was also a symbol of foolishness and stubbornness. It stood near the altar, a beast in a holy place, and the service would end with the priest braying 3 times. The chaos wasn't confined to the church walls. After the mock service, the Lord of Misrule would lead a wild procession through the streets. They would ride in carts, throwing dung at the crowds. They would sing, shout, and perform lewd plays. It was a public spectacle of misrule. The entire city became part of the joke. The powerful watched, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with disgust. The common people often joined in the revelry. It was a day when the rules of society were suspended. It sounds shocking to us now, and it was shocking to many people then, but for several centuries, this was a real and accepted, if controversial, part of the Christian calendar. It was a licensed rebellion, it was a way for the powerless to let off steam, it was a reminder that even the most powerful bishop was just a man, and that all worldly order was fragile. The Feast of Fools showed that underneath the robes and rituals, everyone was a little bit of a fool. It was a messy, loud, and often vulgar tradition, but it served a purpose in the medieval world. It acknowledged the chaos that always simmers just beneath the surface of order. The Feast of Fools didn't appear out of nowhere, it had deep roots. Some of those roots reached all the way back to the Roman Empire. The Romans had a winter festival called Saturnalia. It was a week-long celebration in December, honoring the god Saturn. And it looked a lot like the Feast of Fools. During Saturnalia, the normal social order was completely inverted. Slaves were treated as masters. They would be served meals by their owners. They could speak freely, even insult their masters without fear of punishment. All work and business stopped. The courts closed. A mock king was chosen, the Saturnalicious princeps, or leader of the Saturnalia. He was often chosen by rolling dice. For the duration of the festival, his absurd commands had to be obeyed. People gave each other gifts, often gag gifts like small clay figurines. There was feasting, drinking, and gambling in public. It was a time of pure abandon. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, it had a problem. People didn't want to give up their old festivals. Saturnalia was incredibly popular. So the church often adopted a strategy of co-opting pagan traditions rather than trying to stamp them out completely. Christmas itself was placed near the winter solstice, a time of many pagan celebrations. And many of the traditions of Saturnalia, like gift giving and feasting, were absorbed into the Christmas season. The spirit of inversion, of turning the world upside down, also lingered. It found a new home in the Christian calendar, specifically during the 12 days of Christmas. This period, from December 25th to January 6th, was seen as a special, almost magical time. It was a liminal space, a time between the end of the old year and the beginning of the new. In this gap, the normal rules didn't seem to apply. It was a perfect time for misrule. But the Feast of Fools wasn't just a leftover piece of paganism, it also grew out of the structure of the medieval church itself. The festival was specifically associated with the subdeacons. Their feast day, the Feast of the Circumcision on January 1st, was often the main day for the Feast of Fools. Who were the subdeacons? They were at the bottom rung of the major holy orders. Above them were deacons, priests, and bishops. Below them were minor orders like acolytes and lectors. The subdeacons had duties during the Mass, like preparing the sacred vessels and reading the epistle. It was an important job, but it came with little power and very little pay. They were often young, educated men, but they were stuck at the bottom of a rigid hierarchy. The Feast of Fools was their day. It was a moment when the lowest-ranking members of the clergy could mock the very system that kept them down. And it was their chance to experience power, even if it was just for a few hours. The election of one of their own as the Pope of Fools was a direct parody of the election of a real pope or the appointment of a bishop. It was a performance that said, we understand how the system works and we can see its absurdity. This ecclesiastical context is crucial. The Feast of Fools was an internal affair before it spilled out into the streets. It was a commentary on church life by the people who knew it best from the bottom up. They were not heretics trying to destroy the church. They were believers who were, for one day, allowed to play with the forms and symbols of their faith. They were testing the boundaries. So you have this combination of factors. There was the memory of Roman Saturnalia with its tradition of social inversion. There was the special, time out of time nature of the Christmas season, and there was the frustration and energy of the young, low-ranking clergy. All these elements came together to create the Feast of Fools. It was a Christian festival with a pagan soul, a holy day dedicated to unholy fun, and a rebellion that was for a time allowed by the very authorities it mocked. It was a complex tradition born from a mix of ancient history and the daily realities of medieval church life. To understand the Feast of Fools, you have to picture the scene. Forget the quiet, reverent church you know today. On this day, the cathedral was transformed into a theater of the absurd. The spectacle began with the reversal of status. The high-ranking clergy, the canons, and the dean were either forced to watch or chose to stay away. The subdeacons and choir boys, normally silent and obedient, were now in charge. Their first act was to hijack the liturgy. The Mass, the central and most sacred rite of Christianity, was their primary target for parody. The ceremony would start, but everything would be wrong. The priest for the day, the chosen lord of misrule, might wear the sacred vestments inside out or backward. He might wear a grotesque mask or have his face painted. His acolytes would be similarly dressed, some in women's clothing, others as clowns or devils. The music was a key part of the mockery. The beautiful, solemn tones of Gregorian chant were replaced by bawdy tavern songs. The choir, instead of singing praises to God, would cluck like chickens or howl like wolves. The lyrics of hymns were changed to include dirty jokes and insults aimed at the bishop. The whole service was a cacophony. People would bang pots and pans. They would shout and jeer. The rituals were twisted into grotesque shapes. During the offertory, when bread and wine were brought to the altar, the fools might bring turnips or joke offerings. The most notorious part was the parody of the censing. An incense burner, called a thurible, was used to spread fragrant smoke during solemn moments. The fools would fill the thurible not with incense, but with something that smelled terrible. Sometimes it was the soles of old shoes. Other times it was scraps of leather or even feces. They would swing this smoking pot around, filling the vast cathedral with a disgusting stench, a direct inversion of the sweet smell of sanctity. The altar itself, the holiest spot in the church, became a site of desecration. The fools would set up a table on it and play games of dice, a pastime heavily associated with gambling and sin. They would bring food and drink. Accounts from the period describe them eating fat, greasy sausages and drinking wine from the sacred chalice right on the altar cloth. It was a deliberate act of profanity, a way of showing that for this one day nothing was sacred. The sermon was another highlight. The Lord of Misrule or one of his followers would climb into the pulpit. But instead of delivering a message of spiritual guidance, he would deliver a stream of nonsense. He might put on a pair of spectacles with no lenses and pretend to read from a book held upside down. The sermon would be a mix of gibberish, jokes, and animal sounds. It was a complete mockery of the act of preaching. As mentioned, an animal was often part of the proceedings. The Feast of the Ass, common in France, was frequently combined with the Feast of Fools. A young woman holding a baby would be placed on a donkey, representing the flight into Egypt. The donkey would be led through the town and right up the central aisle of the cathedral to the foot of the altar. The animal's presence was a shocking breach of decorum. At the end of the mock mass, instead of the priest saying, "It, missa esco," the mass is ended, he would bray like a donkey 3 times. The congregation was expected to bray back. After the performance in the church, the chaos moved outdoors. The Lord of Misrule and his followers would pour out of the cathedral doors, leading a noisy parade. They would often be in carts, sometimes half naked despite the winter cold. They would sing, bang drums, and engage in mock fights. They would stop to put on short satirical plays in the town square, making fun of local officials, the bishop, and even the king. This procession was interactive. They would pull people from the crowd to join in their dances. They would demand food and drink from houses they passed. It was a form of licensed begging, backed by the threat of mockery. They might splash people with dirty water or throw flour on them. It was messy, crude, and unpredictable. The Feast of Fools was not a polite affair. It was a raw, physical, and often vulgar explosion of energy. It was a day when the people at the bottom of society could be loud, messy, and disrespectful, all under the cover of sacred tradition. It was a temporary sanctioned anarchy. Why would a deeply religious society tolerate and even participate in something like the Feast of Fools? It seems like a complete contradiction, but the feast served several important functions in the medieval world. It wasn't just mindless chaos, it had a purpose. The most common explanation is that it acted as a social safety valve. Medieval society was extremely hierarchical and rigid. Most people were born into a certain station in life and stayed there. There was a lot of pent-up frustration and resentment, especially among the lower classes and the lower clergy. The Feast of Fools provided a controlled outlet for these feelings. For one day you could mock your superiors. You could break the rules, you could say the unsayable. By allowing this brief period of rebellion, the authorities may have hoped to prevent real rebellion during the rest of the year. Let the pot boil over for a day so it doesn't explode later. It was a way of managing discontent. There was also a theological dimension to it. The feast was a powerful, if chaotic, lesson in humility. It was a living performance of the biblical idea that the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. By watching the subdeacons take over the cathedral, the powerful bishop was reminded that his authority was earthly and temporary. Before God, everyone was equal. The feast was a stark reminder not to take oneself too seriously. It showed that the magnificent rituals of the church, while divinely inspired, were still administered by fallible human beings. It was a way of acknowledging the foolish, messy human side of faith. The feast also functioned as a form of social commentary. The parodies and satires weren't always random. They were often pointed criticisms of real-world problems. If a bishop was known for being greedy, the Lord of Misrule might wear a purse around his neck and pretend to count coins during the sermon. If a priest was known for his long, boring sermons, the mock sermon might go on for an absurdly long time. It was a way for the powerless to speak truth to power, hidden under the mask of folly. A jester can say things to a king that a nobleman cannot. In the same way, the Pope of Fools could criticize the real Pope in a way that would be impossible any other day of the year. But not everyone saw it this way. From the very beginning, the Feast of Fools was controversial. The church leadership was deeply divided. Some bishops and abbots tolerated it as a harmless local custom. Others saw it as blasphemous and dangerous. Over the centuries, a long war was waged against the Feast of Fools. The condemnations came from the highest levels of the church. As early as the 12th century, theologians and reformers were writing letters and sermons against it. They called it an abomination. They said it brought pagan practices into the house of God. They were horrified by the mockery of the Mass, the drunkenness, and the lewd behavior. They argued that it dishonored God and corrupted the faithful. Church councils repeatedly tried to ban it. The Council of Basel in 1431 issued a strong decree against the feast and other similar celebrations. It forbade clergy from wearing masks, dressing as women, or leading dissolute dances in the church or the churchyard. It ordered bishops to punish any priests or clerks who participated, but the bans rarely worked. The tradition was too popular and too deeply entrenched. As soon as one bishop stamped it out in his diocese, it would pop up again a few years later, or continue unabated in the next town over. The resistance to the ban shows how much the festival meant to the participants. It wasn't just a party for them, it was their right. It was a tradition passed down through generations. They saw it as part of their identity as subdeacons and choir boys. They fought to keep it. In some places, when a bishop tried to stop the feast, the lower clergy would riot. This conflict reveals the central tension of the Feast of Fools. Was it a harmless release of pressure, or was it a genuine threat to church authority? Was it a pious lesson in humility, or was it a sacrilegious mockery of faith? The answer was probably a bit of both. It existed in a gray area between acceptable fun and unacceptable blasphemy. For centuries, this tug-of-war continued. The authorities would condemn, and the fools would keep on feasting, keeping their strange, chaotic tradition alive against all odds. The Feast of Fools survived for centuries, weathering condemnations and bans, but by the 16th and 17th centuries, it began to disappear. It wasn't a single event that killed it, it was a slow decline brought on by major shifts in European religion and society. The Protestant Reformation was a huge blow. The reformers, like Martin Luther and John Calvin, had no patience for this kind of ritual. They were trying to purify the church, to strip it of what they saw as Catholic superstition and excess. The Feast of Fools, with its mock masses, dressing up, and chaotic behavior, was everything they preached against. To them, it wasn't a harmless safety valve. It was proof of the corruption and decadence of the Roman Church. As Protestantism spread across Northern Europe, traditions like the Feast of Fools were among the first things to be abolished. Sobriety, order, and solemnity were the new ideals for worship. The Catholic Church also played a role in the feast's demise. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation. It was an effort to reform from within, to standardize worship, and to clamp down on local variations and abuses. The church wanted more control and uniformity. Wild, unsanctioned festivals run by the lower clergy had no place in this new, more disciplined vision of Catholicism. The old tolerance for local customs faded. Bishops were given more power to enforce decorum in their dioceses, and they used it to finally stamp out the last remnants of the feast. Beyond these religious changes, society itself was changing. The Renaissance and the early modern period brought new ideas about civility and public order. The rising middle class, the merchants and town officials, value predictability and respectability. The raw, scatological humor of the Middle Ages started to seem crude and embarrassing. A public procession involving half-naked men throwing dung was no longer seen as festive, but as a public nuisance. The idea of deliberately creating chaos, even for a day, became less and less acceptable. The world was becoming more policed, both literally and culturally, so the Feast of Fools died out. The cathedrals became quiet again, the Lord of Misrule was dethroned for good, the subdeacons went back to their silent, obedient roles all year round. The specific tradition was gone, but its spirit never completely vanished. It left echoes and ghosts that we can still see today. The idea of a period of misrule before a time of solemnity lives on in Carnival and Mardi Gras. These are times of feasting, parades, masks, and social license right before the austerity of Lent. The chaos is more organized, and it generally stays out of the church, but the core idea of a final wild celebration is a direct descendant of the medieval season of misrule. The spirit of inversion is also present in April Fool's Day. It's a day for pranks and hoaxes, a day when you can trick people and briefly disrupt the normal order of things. It's a much tamer version of the Feast of Fools, but the underlying impulse to play with truth and reality for a day is the same. And the idea of using satire to critique the powerful is stronger than ever. The Lord of Misrule's mock sermons were an early form of what we now see in political cartoons, late-night comedy shows, and satirical websites. These modern forms of satire use humor and exaggeration to point out the flaws of our leaders and institutions. Like the medieval fools, they operate in a special licensed space where criticism that would otherwise be unacceptable is allowed. They speak truth to power through the mask of a joke. The Feast of Fools itself is a product of a specific time and place. It could only exist in a world that was both deeply religious and deeply comfortable with paradox, a world that understood that reverence and ridicule could be two sides of the same coin. That world is gone, but the human need that the feast addressed remains. The need to laugh at authority, to release pressure, to feel the thrill of turning the world upside down, if only for a little while. The feast is over, but the fools are still with us.